Welcome. I'm Phil Ware. This is ToGather. We're glad you've joined us. I don't know how things are going in your part of the world, but it is cold in central Arkansas this week. I hope you have a warm place, a good place, so that you can be physically in good shape. But even more, I pray that all our verse of the day family, our ToGather.church family, finds itself in spiritual good health. And that's specifically what our verse of the day is about this week. Our focus this week is on asking for wisdom, and it comes from James 1, verses 5 and 6. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. When we come to the subject of wisdom, we need to understand that biblical wisdom is a key emphasis in the scriptures, both in the Old Testament and with James, it comes into the New Testament, and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in many ways fits into this wisdom that is spiritual wisdom. When we talk about wisdom, we have three key questions. What is it? Why is it important? And how do we gain it? James is going to position wisdom and help us understand four key things about wisdom. What does he mean when he talks about wisdom? Well, first, he means that true wisdom is part of a rich heritage that we have in the Old Testament. When we open up the scriptures, we find three key books in the Old Testament that focus on wisdom. Those books are Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes. And they probably should be read in that order to grab a hold of what God is ultimately saying in total about wisdom. James positions his short epistle as part of that wisdom, and we need to understand how these books fit. Proverbs gives us principles generally true to guide our lives in everyday living. Some people want to make Proverbs guarantees or promises, but that's not the nature of Proverbs. They're the kinds of things that we teach our children, or we learn in school, or we have a mentor that trains us to be wise in the ways of the world. These truths are true generally. Most of the time, these things prove true. But sometimes life erupts with difficulties and pain, which brings us to the book of Job. And Job reminds us that while Proverbs are generally true, they shouldn't be used to explain the fault of someone in their suffering. God rebuked Job's miserable comforters for blaming him for the misfortune that fell upon him. Job didn't have bad things in his life because he did bad things, because he lived foolishly. Job 1 reminds us that Job was a good, godly man, well above the godliness of his age. And yet these things happened because there was spiritual warfare going on in the background that he didn't know about and his comforters didn't know about. So while Proverbs are generally true and give us principles to live by, we can't use those principles to blame someone for their suffering. Instead, we should sit and mourn with them and love them and support them through their misery and hopefully be God's agent to bring them back into his loving relationship and help them heal. And then the third book of wisdom in the Old Testament is Ecclesiastes. And the writer, traditionally called Solomon, but who identifies himself as Kohelet, tells us a number of proverbs. But some of these proverbs seem to conflict or have cross purposes. And in life, we found that to be true. While some things are true most of the time, something else may be true most of the time, and those two things butt heads, and life gets difficult. And so Ecclesiastes comes along and says, yes, Proverbs are generally true, and we should live by them, and they come from God. But we can't use those to blame somebody for their own problems. And third, those proverbs really don't get to the heart of the matter. When you read the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet reminds us that the best thing to do in life is to enjoy our work that we do with our hands, our friends, and our food and our drink. But most importantly of all, to reverence God and do what he asks us to do, to obey his commands, because ultimately we want to honor him. That's true wisdom. So when we look at wisdom from this standpoint, we understand that wisdom is probably outside us without some help. And so the second principle of wisdom that James is built upon is that true wisdom comes from God. That's why James is going to remind us in his short little 5-chapter epistle that we've got to ask God for wisdom. We've got to seek God and his wisdom. We need to pray for wisdom from God, because wisdom ultimately is from God. So when we talk about wisdom, true wisdom has a heritage in the scriptures, and true wisdom comes from God. But why is it important? Wisdom is important because it helps us navigate life effectively. It's especially good to help us overcome obstacles. And our verse of the day in James 1, 5, and 6 occurs in a context where early believers are facing trials of various kinds. And wisdom was needed to negotiate the difficult work of navigating the political life and the social life as a believer who's seeking to honor God in a godless world. And so the context of our verse of the day, asking for wisdom, is in the context of overcoming serious obstacles. And then fourth, James emphasizes that true wisdom connects us to the character that God wants for us as his people. Wisdom was not about filling our heads with knowledge, not biblical wisdom. Wisdom is different than knowledge. Most of us know that. We can be educated beyond practicality and get where we don't know how to negotiate the regular things of life. Wisdom is knowing how to apply the things we know in our head to the things we face in our life. Look at James 3 and a corresponding passage on wisdom. And he emphasizes that wisdom shows up in our behaviors. We show it by a good life, by deeds done in humility, living a life that is pure and peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, having good fruit, impartial, sincere, and living as a peacemaker. So true wisdom is important to James because it helps us navigate life effectively, especially as we overcome obstacles in our lives. And true wisdom connects us to the character that God wants to form in us as his people. So that brings us to our final question. How do we get wisdom? How do we attain it? And first, we have these scriptures in the Bible that focus on wisdom, so clearly we pursue them and we study them. But even that kind of knowledge going in our head is not going to necessarily translate into wise living. And so we need to know that wisdom ultimately comes from asking God for it. If any lacks wisdom, you should ask God, our verse of the day says. God gives it generously to all who are seeking it, and he doesn't do it to find fault. If we ask, it's going to be given to us, especially if we don't doubt. James adds on to this emphasis on wisdom in chapters 3 and chapter 4. Look at chapter 4 and see how he emphasizes that we have to ask God for wisdom. You do not have because you do not ask. And then there's the asking with the proper motives. That's important. We do it because we want our lives to honor and reflect the character of God. So as we look at wisdom, we need to realize wisdom is about God, about living for God, about living the life of God. So wisdom's about God, his generosity and willingness to share it. And it has to be about our eagerness to gain and acquire it. And most of all, it's about having his character formed in us. God wants us to be wise, not so that we can be smarter than everyone else, but so that we can live lives that reflect him, display his character, and negotiate life effectively to help other people. God says, ask and I'll give you wisdom. I long to give it generously to you. And ask, but don't doubt. Wisdom is about God. It's about his generosity and longing to share it with us. It's about our eagerness to gain it from God. And it's about his character being formed in us. God longs to give you and me wisdom. He's generous with it, but we have to seek it. And he's given us the book of Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes and James in the Bible to help teach us the principles of true godly wisdom. And then when we add in the Sermon on the Mount and the truths there, we realize many of the things that are true wisdom go against the common sense of the world because they're about bringing the kind of character and compassion and faithfulness that's only displayed in God. True wisdom is given to those of us who ask. It comes down from the Father, from whom every good and perfect gift comes, and he longs to give it to us so that we can live for him in our broken world. Please ask God for wisdom. Join me in seeking it, and let's be people that shine forth with the grace and mercy and character and faithfulness of God. Until next week, may God bless you with wisdom.